Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, this session is brought to you by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in our event Research, Teaching and You. And here we hear from the School of History, Religious Studies, Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology, cleverly called HRSSC. But the topic for this session is researching power and belief. So two very, very abstract concepts. And here we have three academics from the school to talk about how they are researching power and belief. And I'm joined by Steve Toombs, Amanda Goodrich and Paul-Francois Tremlett. Thank you very much for coming along today. You'll also see at home that we've got some wordles. To me, power means, and also to me, beliefs are. So you can put three things into those, otherwise your results won't submit. So do put some words in there, and if you can't think of three, add a full stop so that your results can submit, and you can also then see what other people are saying at home as well. So we're going to introduce you to an interesting ways that research is being undertaken in the school and give you a sense of some of the differences and also similarities in research techniques across three very different disciplines. So we've got history, criminology and religious studies focusing here. The researchers are all arguably discussing very different aspects and different ways of investigating and reconstructing power and belief. So in first, they might seem very tangible ideas, but they are grasped by the lot of you. So Steve, can I first ask you please about how you see power and how you see power working?
Oh, well, that's a big question, but I'll try and be brief. I mean, I think one of the things that interests me about power, Karen, is the way that power silences and power also gives voice, and power determines what can be said within a certain framework and what can't be said, who can say it, what statements to take seriously, what statements to dismiss, what can't be truth, what can be true. So I've recently been doing some work on the fallout from the fire at Grenfell Tower. And you see power in operation in those ways very clearly there. So power in operation in terms of how, for example, the public inquiry was set up, the terms of reference. So the terms of reference establishes what can be said in that framework and what can't be said, who can say it, who the participants are, who has voice therefore, who runs the show in the sense of who is the chair of the inquiry and who makes up the panel. And all of these things really determine what comes out of the other end of the inquiry, who gets to speak, what gets said and what gets defined as the truth, really. So power is very clearly in operation in a series of ways in that process.
So you've got some very obvious hierarchical structural
Absolutely.
ways of looking at power, but equally, from what I'm gathering, you're saying that actually that's not always the case. There are other influences of power that can come through from the bottom up, from what people are saying, and maybe not as you're pointing out.
No, I mean, there are some clear dynamics there in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, also in terms of gender. But these are all of these issues I pointed to earlier on are also sorts of contest. So there is space for arguments from below, for example, to win out. There is space to push back hierarchical or structural power. So these things are never entirely predictable, and of course that's one of the reasons that makes them interesting. I mean, they are sites of contest, sites of struggle, to be honest.
So while Steve researches corporate harm and sort of things from a criminology perspective, Amanda, you're approaching things from a very different perspective. How does power play out in your work? And just to remind our audience, if they don't know you already, that you're from a sort of history perspective.
Well, I work in the 18th century, so in that period, the concept of power is a very elite, top-down kind of concept. Power lay very much with the king, the nobility and the church, and ordinary people were very much subjects. So it was a very specific kind of sense of power. However, no ruler can rule without the acquiescence of the people to some degree, and the people used to get together collectively to try and influence those in power to get what they wanted. So they might riot or petition or they had certain customary ways of dealing with these issues. So power was very much a specific kind of concept then. And of course at the time, during the French Revolution, for instance, the French Revolution brought in the idea that the people were citizens, that the power lay with them and not with the elite. So it was a very significant shift at that period towards the people and away from a kind of top-down approach.
So people in the state, one sort of way of looking at things, whereas Paul, from a religious studies perspective, you've been very interested in colonialisation.
Yeah, so I've done quite a lot of research in the Philippines and picking up on something Steve said, power is something that constrains, but it also enables. So colonialism, Spanish colonialism in the Philippines was also Christianization. So Christianization was part of the domination, part of the colonial structures, building towns around a church plaza and spatially organizing people and creating hierarchies, racial hierarchies. But Christianity was also what gave people eventually a voice and sort of played a key role in the Philippine Revolution in 1896. So on the one hand then, Christianity is involved in, if you like, ideological control, colonial control, but at the same time it becomes a way for people to start to see and anticipate their own desires and needs and to struggle for something, for a different state of affairs, and in this case Filipino independence.
These are all massive areas, and what I'm wondering now is how you actually go about researching some of these. I mean, you know, there are so many different sources and ways of looking at things to establish, you know, various things both from the top down and bottom up. How do you, what sources, what methods are each of you using to try and research these areas?
Well, so my areas of research are around crimes and harms committed by state bodies, police, prison service, for example, and corporations, private companies, pollution, health and safety offence, and so on and so forth. So I tend to find that the least reliable source of information are those bodies themselves.
Yes.
States construct certain kinds of truths about events, as do corporations. I mean, they have their own take on the world, of course, and they're very professional at producing an image and a version of events. So what I tend to do is to try and access those voices which tend to be marginalised voices, if you want, from the bottom, often victims' voices. So I tend to work with victims' movements. For example, in the field of health and safety, I work with something called the Hazards Movement, which is a loose alliance of groups around the country who work around health and safety issues at work, and also a campaigning organisation called FAC, Families Against Corporate Killers, and these are all families who've lost somebody, been bereaved by a workplace death, son, a brother, a father, a daughter, and so on and so forth. And they each have their own struggles for justice, so to speak. So I tend to kind of give voice isn't right, but I tend to access voices, the voice of those people, in many ways the people at the sharp end of state and corporate activity, and that also then has its own challenges, of course.
And sources are a key area in history.
Oh, yeah, well, they certainly are. Yes, that's saying something. I mean, if you're searching history kind of in a more general way than I am at the moment, you would find there were plenty of sources. For instance, you would find that elite leaders often left masses of material. They left personal letters, diaries, memoirs, accounts, parliamentary papers, etc., etc. But I've been researching a man from the West Indies who was of dual heritage, African and British descent. And for those people who are more marginal in society, they've often left much less material. So I've had to expand the sort of sources I would be looking at, and I've had to look at newspaper reports, letters written by other people, all sorts of material that is more fringe and less reliable. And I've also incorporated in the book I've just written the stories and myths that surround this particular man, which are not necessarily true or factually correct, but they give some information about him, that, or an opinion from other people, or an idea about him. So there are bits missing in the kind of jigsaw of his story, but that's all part and parcel of writing a kind of intellectual biography of somebody who is marginalised rather than somebody who's very central in society. So historians often, if they're not, rather like Steve was saying, if you're not focusing on the kind of mainstream, you will have to use an awful lot of different kinds of sources and analyse them more closely in order to find the information you need. And you won't always find it, and you will always find there are bits missing.
Yeah. But Steve, you were talking about legitimate sources.
Well, I was just wanted to pick up on one of the points Amanda made, or one of the phrases that you used, because you talked about sources which are deemed less reliable.
Yes.
And to me, that's really interesting, because when the state speaks or when corporate representatives speak, those voices and those statements automatically have some air of authority. Around them, whereas the kinds of evidence, some of the evidence you was talking about, what you refer to being more marginal, and certainly some of the evidence that I use, but talking and accessing experiences of victims and of victimisation, that's always already deemed less reliable and more marginal it's always already deemed somehow less true. And actually by my reliance upon, to some extent, or my use of those sources, my work often attracts charges of bias, or not being sufficiently neutral or value-free. Albeit I kind of argue strongly, I have argued and will argue strongly that it's perfectly rigorous and open to challenge and defence.
Yes, and one of the things in history, particularly as you go back in time, less is retained. So somebody who's more marginal, not only did they not produce much, because people wrote less then anyway now, and we don't have recordings of what they said. So not only is there less of it, but also people at the time didn't promote them, and so they didn't write so much about them, and so they tended to end up being more marginalised in their own time and then by historians. So it's a kind of ongoing process. So the person I'm writing about was a really significant radical in the French Revolution, and I think he was probably the most radical revolutionary in Britain in 1793 to 4. But, you know, it's taken me a long time to actually dig all this out of the archives, because historians have missed him, because people at the time didn't write about him either. And so he has been mentioned by other historians, but, you know, this is the first time anyone's written any kind of biography of him. Partly because of the source situation.
But you're doing something very interesting, because, you know, you've called it a biography, and indeed you've also referred to it at other times as an academic monograph, and so you're using a lot of sources.
It's both.
And also we've sort of acknowledged that there are different sort of values in some of these sources. You've incorporated things like letters and peripheral sources to that to add these flavours, and I just wondered how you'd included that in some of your writing, acknowledging these sort of different power bases, I guess, that those sources hold.
Well, I haven't really created a hierarchy of sources in actual fact. What I've kind of done is I've just included them as they are. So I might have a chapter which would have a little story that somebody told about the character, and then I might have some letters from the Home Office. And the story the person told was probably not true, but it kind of illustrates certain ideas about him. I mean, there were 2 obituaries written for him, one in 1794 and one in 1830 when he actually died. And so there's, you know, lots of conflicting evidence, which I just present and discuss, but I don't really suggest. Well, actually, in the obituaries, one of them's obviously more right than the other. But you know, generally speaking,
at least one crucial respect.
yeah, exactly.
We've got a dead body.
But you know, it's the kind of question of not really creating a hierarchy. So I don't say this source is more important because it says this. I present them all and then discuss what they say and how valuable they might or might not be.
And it's this difference, I guess, in which I'd like to bring Paul into it's this idea about things that are going on in people's heads versus what's happening. There's sort of different ways, I guess, of taking behaviour, writings, you know, things that people are doing, saying, etc., and using those as evidence sources.
So we're on to belief. Yeah, I mean, obviously people start thinking about religions. They tend, as their first port of call, to go to belief. I'm not always convinced that belief is the best place or the only place to start thinking about religious studies, but belief is that signal to ourselves that we're trying to think about what someone else is thinking about. We're trying to access what's going on in someone else's mind, and the relationship of that to sources. For example, if we read some source materials about some period of history, or even if we're reading source materials about something contemporary like Grenfell, that doesn't necessarily reflect the contents of somebody's mind. The relationship between those two things is not at all straightforward. And then the relationship to power. What is the relationship between what we're thinking about, what people are thinking about at a given society or given moment in time, and the organisation of power structures in society? So when we start talking about belief, it's not just the private mental world of a person. In fact, it soon sort of leaks beyond that skull and starts to become a social question quite quickly. And I think it's really important when we think about belief is not get trapped in a sort of very narrow psychological way of thinking about belief, but try and keep it as social as possible, with an eye on quite a number of different factors, such as sources, such as the importance of thinking about power. So why someone says they believe X is quite an involved series of investigations. And certainly whenever I've been doing field work, I've never started a conversation with, well, what do you believe?
Yeah.
Because that can cause quite a few sort of problems. I mean, the person might just say, well, I believe in this, and then you think, oh, well, of course you do, or why? You know, it doesn't really lead. You're not really exploring anything in any depth.
So belief is not just about believing in a particular religion, etc. It's a lot wider than that. And it was interesting your take on belief, Steve, because we were talking earlier about, you know, the extent to which people can sort of believe that things might be restorative, or you know, justice may be done, for example, in the Grenfell case, and the extent to which some of those, I guess, beliefs or faiths or ideas were really important in that whole process, and how it did tie into power.
Yeah, one of the recurring kind of themes in my research career and in the work that I've done and I'm doing is that I see belief in one very specific way. I see belief diminish in front of my eyes almost. So the kind of the process is typically this. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, you know, however smart we think we are, I think we all literally grow up in this society with an idea and a belief that if some legal wrong, some violation of the law, if we're victimised in some way, that accountability, redress, the righting of that wrong is delivered through the criminal justice system. That's where accountability is determined for certainly the most serious harms. And that's something we all to some extent buy into, even if we claim to be sceptical about it. I think it's a very powerful belief. But what I often find working with victims, for example, victims of a workplace death, the family of a young man killed at work, they'll very quickly understand that the young man was killed because safety law was being broken by the manager or the company, and they'll expect then the criminal justice system to deliver accountability in the way it claims, through a prosecution, through a sentence which looks just, and maybe some form of restitution. And that almost never happens. And you'd see families over, and these processes take years often, and you see families, you see that belief just diminish and crumble, and that faith that they've just had innately for so long just disappear. And that's just a recurring process when you're kind of working in the area that I work in.
And you spoke about people being powerless before. Does this play into that?
Yeah, I think people a part of the diminishing of that belief is that people recognise that actually their status in society, or the relative status of the offender or offenders, and be it an organisation or senior individuals in that organisation, as compared to people who live in a working class community or a working class family whose son has been killed at work. What becomes more important is not the truth or the facts of the matter, the case. What becomes more important is the social power, the social capital, and the social standing of the individuals or organisations involved. That becomes clear very quickly. So power and belief kind of work in a very interesting interplay through those processes.
And it's almost a re-victimisation then of people who are already victims. Cyclical.
Absolutely. People say very explicitly, they say, you know, look, we were victimised by X, Y, or Z, this death, and now we feel doubly victimised because of the way we've been treated by the criminal justice system. And actually, often they then often say that victimisation has taken place because we're not being treated as if we're real victims. So it's at least a double victimisation, but it is a process of re-victimisation.
Yeah. So going back to these sources, I can see why, you know, people might claim that, you know, you are focusing on quite a specific area. Indeed, you are. You know, that sort of end of the spectrum. But Paul, I'd really like to know how you're researching some of these things and what sources you're using and how you go about doing that.
Well, my last research was not historical at all. It was a project called Reassembling Democracy, and I was working on protest camps and thinking about them as ritual spaces, accessing new forms of imagination, sacred, a sort of idea of the sacred, if you like, and the groups were trying to basically get that sacred energy and release it into wider society to create a different sort of a headspace for people to think with and move around in. And the kinds of sources for that kind of work is being at the camps, talking to the participants, looking at the kind of objects and materials that they're using, but also very carefully attending to the description or accounts of the camps and protests in official media, mainstream media, but also independent media, and their own media, the way they might be using social media, for example. So it's you're trying to slowly build a picture Of course, you never complete that picture. There's never a complete total representation, but you're building a picture and you're comparing it with the other literature that's been written about other camps by other academics, and working through that material that way.
But what's interesting, I guess, and what's different between the way that you and Amanda are both working is that Amanda's focusing on one specific discipline, using a range of sources within that, and we'll return to that in a second, whereas religious studies often use very different disciplines, you know, and use those in a way that enhances both the methodology as well as the sources. So you've got this dual complexity there, I guess, of what you're looking at.
Well, my field's by its nature, I think, interdisciplinary. So some of my colleagues are historians and are working with much the same sources that Amanda works with. And others among us have more sociological or anthropological backgrounds. And we're doing more kind of, I mean, for example, when the Occupy camp at St Paul's was about to go, I went and did what we might call salvage ethnography, which is go there quickly, gather as much information as you can, possibly before it's gone. And that's not 100 miles away from the kind of work that Steve's doing.
Amanda, I wonder if I may just talk to you briefly about context, because we've been talking about these various sources, and as a historian, you will be, you know, acutely aware of the context of the specific period in which you're researching and the extent to which that plays out, both in terms of the nation, etc., as it moves out. How do you then take these sources and sort of shape them within the context that they've occurred?
Well, context is always absolutely massively important in history, and you need to contextualise everything you do, which is something I always say to students. And at the moment, the work I've been doing, which is a biography, it's really important to contextualise that small history in the bigger history, the big political, cultural, social history of the time, to consider both your own example, other examples, counter-examples, to make sure that you can put your smaller history within a bigger history picture, and that it will actually be of value. So it's always important to do that and to make sure that you very much contextualise everything. As to the sources, yes, I might use one source that I have, and then that might be backed up by other sources that have been written by people in the same area or from a more significant writer or something. Of course, we have the issue that the sources we use are limited. We don't have anything oral, or we don't have any photography, we don't have any film, we don't have any social media, any of that. So it's written, visual material, really, and that makes a difference to the scope that we have. Unlike Paul, who can, you know, go and look at the remnants of a camp at St Paul's, we can't do that really.
Or Steve, who can ask people.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to ask people, actually. That'd be really helpful.
You're in the wrong area.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd like to end by asking how some of this is sort of impacting in modules, on teaching, etc., which is one of the focuses of today. Steve, we have a very exciting new Criminology Level 1 module. I wonder if you could briefly tell us about that and the context in which some of your research might feature.
Yeah, so DD 105, we're making that module now, introducing criminology, an entry-level module. It's really exciting, a lot of fun for us. As you'd expect, at that level, one of the things that one of the kind of thematics of the module is to ask the question, what is crime? And there are many ways of thinking about that. And one of the ways we encourage students to play, or will encourage students to play with that question, and again, there's a constant through the module, is by focusing on death and in particular different kinds of murder. And I'll give you 3 scenarios. So one kind of death is where, say, 2 young men have a fight outside a nightclub at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. One pulls a knife, stabs the other, and one dies. A second kind of death might be typically a young black man, physically restrained in illegal ways in a police cell, dies. And how does that get dealt with? Well, how that gets dealt with, technically that could be prosecuted as murder. No police or prison officer has ever been prosecuted successfully for murdering somebody in their care. So there's an interesting question there. And the third scenario, again, we can use the example of Grenfell. 72 people died in very predictable circumstances. In fact, they spoke of the way in which they would die in a blog about 7 months prior to the fire. Those deaths technically can't be prosecuted as murder. They may be prosecuted as corporate manslaughter. That's possible. If they are, there'll be a fine, which the local residents will pay as council taxpayers for the most part. So the questions then become, what are the economic, social, political, and indeed legal processes which separate out 3 sets of deaths? categorise them in different ways and generate different ways of dealing with them. So it's kind of one of the ways in which my own interests and that of my colleagues feed into the module.
Excellent. And Amanda, can you tell us briefly something about A223 even, sorry, because whilst your monograph doesn't feature within that, a lot of the ideas are relevant.
Yes, A223 is our early modern cultural and social history course, which has just been running for a year. It's in its second year now. And I wrote 2 chapters for that. And the first one was on popular protest of the people protesting against basically power, and it has some very interesting. They had some very interesting ways of doing this through kind of customary rituals, through petitioning the king, through rioting, and the sources for that actually were quite interesting as well, because they didn't write about it themselves, so I had to use newspaper reports, woodcuts, pictures, and other small public sources, not things that from the writers themselves for the most part. So that links to the work I've been doing on radicalism in the 18th century, which is a major part of my research area. And the second one was that in another chapter I've put a section on identity, which links with my present research. And in that section, we've looked at how the English viewed people from abroad, which was mostly very negatively and with great xenophobia. And there's a couple of quite funny examples where I've used Gilray caricature prints from the time that amusingly depicted particular instances. And the first one was an English envoy visiting China and presenting to the emperor all these children's toys as gifts, which suggested a kind of sense of superiority by the English, that this is what the Chinese would want, which of course they didn't. And the second one was a very funny print of an Englishman and a Frenchman sitting side by side. And the Englishman is the sturdy John Bull character with his kind of pint of beer and sort of sensible commercial man. And the French guy is a sort of effete aristocrat, very highly dressed, very effeminate looking. And the concept was that, the English were always these kind of sturdy, sensible people, and the French were very effeminate and feeble when their peasants were starving. And so using those caricatures, they both said quite a lot about the topics, and those topics were both connected to my research quite closely, in fact. And I think it brings the subject alive more if it's something you're really engaged with.
Absolutely. And the same for you, Paul, because your research about the Philippines is featured in A227.
Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 units in A227, and the first one is about Manila and the spaces of Manila. Manila was built by the Spanish, and they built most of the the early towns and cities are all according to a sort of particular design that they also used in the New World. And so that unit is actually about how basically religious spaces in Manila are changing as the city changes from a sort of church plaza type religiosity to digital media platforms, mega churches and television religiosity. And that's all about Manila's changing architecture from a sort of a closed city of walled spaces to a more open city of flyovers and stuff like that. More open doesn't necessarily more free, by the way. And my other unit is about cargo cults, which raises questions of power and belief very nicely, because it's about conversion, colonialism, capitalism, sugar capitalism, but also about these things called cargo cults and people's sort of expectations of what cargo cult believers maybe believe. And what the unit does is it tries to unpack issues around rationality and so forth in that particular story.
Lovely. Let's go have a quick trip to the hot desk and see how HJ and Damon are getting on.
We're having lots of good and related chat. There's so many good points and comments. I like Sarah's talking about thinking that people's own experience of power and authority informs their beliefs. So if they had repeatedly bad experience with power or authority, then their beliefs are just corroded, or their trust in that organisation as well. And Janet's saying about a case, I think, for me it's interesting how Doreen Lawrence wouldn't give up on the injustices that they encountered in the justice system. I think you touched upon that as well.
Yeah, a couple of people, so Janet and Davin have been saying about the access to justice and money being a barrier, and how intimidating the court system can be, no matter what side you're on. And coming back to the religious aspect, the belief in core religious texts and the corruption that people have used to push extremism onto people, and the power that has had. So it's a really wide-ranging discussion that's been going on.
I know there was a really great comment from Russell as well. He says it's all very interesting and exciting, and he wants to know if there's any chance of being able to assist with helping Steve or Paul do their research. Maybe you could give advice about how he could get into it himself as well.
Well, maybe you can email us or something.
Yeah, send us an email,
Yeah,
studenthub@open.ac.uk. Let us know what you're prepared to do, and then we'll see how you might be able to
I know
help.
we answered, just finally, we asked a question on Twitter about unexpected animals in our modules, and the maths department actually said that frogs and toads do appear there as well, and there are some sheep, and I've heard we have got a star chicken and a stunt double as well for our chicken, so we are interested in hear about that in the chat as well.
I remember very well Richard Heffernan talking about how making a module was like boiling a frog, and a piece of much hilarity. So yeah, okay. Well, thank you all very much. That's been a fascinating discussion, and we're now going to show you a quick video, some of our Who's Who videos from the faculty, and we're going to look at Victorian women. And then next, we'll find out more about animals, in particular chickens, in our next research, translating research into chicken, migration, citizenship, and chickens. So we'll see you in a few minutes for that next session.